we were instructed to emphasize not the common points but the differences, which is not so easy. But let's do our best. And there is no person with whom I would prefer to talk about differences than my old friend Muhammad Legenhausen. Firstly, some preliminaries. What do we mean if we talk about the Christian notion of God? Yeah, which notion is that, or whose God talk is relevant here, or which benchmark, so to say, could we use? Yeah. Firstly, it's an important point to distinguish between God conceptions and God Himself. Yeah, people have a lot of conceptions about God, and some are quite misguided, probably. A conception of God is not the same as God. So this is the old distinction between sense and reference. So people connect a certain sense with the word God, but they still might refer to the same object. So conceptions of God might be different, but people might refer to the same God. So we must be clear what is at stake here. Do we talk about it might be that we talk about the same God, but that our conceptions of God might differ to a certain extent. What is relevant? The folk talk about God, or rather the philosophical notions about God, or rather the theological notions about God? Yeah. So here in these few minutes, I will focus on the philosophical notions of God, but those which are probably influenced by the Christian context in which they were developed. Yeah. Why do I focus on this second option? Yeah, the folk talk about God is probably not so interesting, and the folk talk about God is in many cases anthropomorphic and obviously inconsistent. So I think this is not such an interesting matter for philosophers of religion. Theological notions about God, well, this goes a bit beyond my competence. So I mean, I sometimes study theology, but I wouldn't call myself a big theologian. So I best stick to philosophical notions about God, which are, however, strongly influenced by the Christian context in which they were developed. And as I said before, commonalities would be easier to find than differences. Yeah? And it's also the fact that it's the case that the differences sometimes cut across confessions. So it's the differences are not Christians against Muslims, but among the Christians you'll find people who have a very anthropomorphic conception of God. Yeah? Think of Richard Swinburne. So you also have people who have a rather Neoplatonic and very abstract notion of God. Yeah? So you have panentheists among the Christians. You have very anthropomorphic thinkers among the Christians, and Muhammad tells me the same is the case among Islam. So it's not that easy. So the Christian notion versus the Islamic notion, just as some preliminary remark. Now, an obvious difference, of course, is and a salient point of the Christian notion of God is the Trinity, the incarnation of the second divine person in Jesus Christ, and on the other hand, on the Islamic side, the notion of Tawhid. In this word is the Arabic word wahid, which means one. Yeah, and so the radical oneness of God, which is stressed by Muslim thinkers. Yeah. God is understood as radically one for various reasons, and one reason is to avoid a misconception or even a sin which is called shirk. Yeah? shirk is in my understanding, to make a God out of something which is not God, to deify inner worldly things, and this is a sacrilege, and this is a strong misconception. So Islam, as I understand it, conceives God in radical oneness. The Christian conception of God essentially contains something like internal relation. There is something like an inner processuality going on. God has a certain polarity. He is somehow one and somehow three. There are relations between the Father and the Son and the Spirit, and so on. And this is something which is an ever ongoing point of discussion between Muslims and Christians. However, there is also a lot of common history here. There is a strong common root, and academic Christian theology also stresses this oneness to a certain extent. The common root is Neoplatonism. It's the notion in Greek, tohen, the one, which is the ultimate explanation of everything. And on the Christian side, the counterpart to Tawhid is divine simplicity. Divine simplicity is something that is not so simple to explain, especially to students. But the key point is that according to the Christian doctrine, all the divine attributes are, in the last consequence, identical. Yeah. So God's almightiness, God's omniscience, God's eternity, God's love, God's cognition, and so on. God's perfect mode of these attributes is in the end identical, and they are all identical to the one, so to say, super attribute of simply being God. Yeah. There is not even a composition between God as an object and his attributes, because any composition would cry out for further explanation. In God, everything falls together, even his existence and his essence. So God is not exemplifying a kind of something. Yeah? So in God, everything we can say about him coincides and is, or refers to one and the same attribute, the super attribute of simply being God. Now, there is, of course, a theological problem here, which I just briefly address and do not solve. How can a simple God at the same time be Trinitarian? If God is so radically simple, how can he be Trinitarian? I mean, how can he be really Trinitarian? Yeah. There is, of course, a temptation to slide into a position which was often called modalism. Yeah, that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are just something like modes, or Latin modi, or just appearances, or in a modern language, something like avatars of God. Yeah, this doctrine of modalism was often marked as a theological error. I mean, there are still theologians around who are modalists in the last consequence, but how is this compatible with the doctrine of simplicity? And of course, how is a radically simple God compatible with the doctrine of incarnation? How can a simple God incarnate in a historical person 2000 years ago? As I said, I am not a theologian, and I don't want to be dilettantish here. I think the strategy of a solution is roughly the following. Everything that sounds like an objectual side in God only refers to his manifestations in the creation. God has, for some reasons, out of his freedom, decided to create a universe which is in time and which is in space, And if he manifests himself there, then he has to surrender to the categories which are understandable there. So a certain objectuality comes into God. So I think that is the strategy that most theologians would entertain in order to get this problem solved, how simplicity and Trinity can be compatible. So, as I said, I don't want to go deeper into that because I am not a theologian of Trinity. I'm simply too stupid for that. I leave that to other more clever people. But I think there is a deeper problem here, or a deeper difference here between Christianity and Islam. In Christianity, most theologians would regard God as a person as well, or they would say he is personnel, or he is person-like. I am very cautious here using my language because this is a rather new way of speaking about God. If you look into the history of theology, speaking of God as a person or person-like emerges only in the 16th or 17th century. Before, the notion of a person was reserved to the Trinitarian person. So the Father and the Son and the Spirit were persons, but not God as a whole. So today it's a commonplace to say God is personal, but this is astonishingly young in Christian theology. So the far majority view in Christian theology is that God is something like a person, and he has something like a mind. Now, why? What are the reasons for that? Firstly, although they did not speak like that, it is a consistent theological tradition that God is nothing abstract, or nothing like a factor in the universe. He is not a natural force or a natural power or something like that. He was always described somehow like a kind of something person-like. Secondly, and that's a philosophical reason, the personality results from God's explanatory function. If God is really the ultimate causal explanation of the universe, then he cannot be similar to something in the universe. He cannot be another object in the universe. He cannot be something that operates along the natural laws. He cannot be a cosmic factor. So which other kinds of causal explanations do we know? Yeah, the one form of causal explanation is by things that work according to the natural laws. The other form of causal explanation is by things which are person-like, which are agents. Yeah. So there are things which are best explained by the natural laws. So if you get a cold and recover from the cold by taking in aspirin, so the best explanation is by objects working according to the natural laws, like the aspirin molecules and so on. But if I want to explain why I wear blue socks today, then the best explanation is, yeah, because I wanted it like that. I decided to do it like that. It's a causal explanation. There is no interesting natural laws explanation for the color of my socks today. So a truly ultimate explanation of the universe cannot be in terms of natural factors again. And the only alternative in sight is some sort of personal explanation by something mental-like. Now, of course, there is a problem here. How can that be without sliding into anthropomorphism again? The usual solution is that God has his attributes analogously only. We can point at them linguistically. We can address them by using our language. We can circumscribe them from God's explanatory function. So we can say an ultimate explanation for a trait X in the universe cannot display this trait X again. And hence, God must be immaterial, he must be eternal, he must be immutable, he must be non-spatial, he must be person-like, he must be free, so he's not law-bound. So we can say something about these attributes of God, but we should not think that we can easily define him, or that we can, so to say, catch him in a box and completely describe him. So also, if we talk about God, if we do that in a personal matter, and we do this in an analogous matter, we should always be aware of the fact that any similarities of God and things in the universe are always accompanied by big dissimilarities. And we must be very careful in speaking about God, but we should not. So we are not condemned to being silent. So if we cannot say anything about God, we would land in negative theology, and then this would be a very insufficient position, not only for the philosophers and the theologians, but it would also be very insufficient for the religious people. So the God about whom you can say nothing is very unsatisfactory for the religious practice as well. So I think this is a difference that Islamic thinkers are hesitant to say that God is a person or person-like, as far as I understand it. One last point: I perceive a certain tension in the Islamic conception of God, a tension which I could never, really solve for myself. Firstly, again, there are so many common points between the Christian and the Islamic conception. It's easier to find the commonalities, and it's more difficult to pick out the differences. So what is common? For instance, this notion of explanatory unification, that God is the ultimate explanation for everything in the universe. So this is a common point between Islam and Christianity, as far as I understand. Or the 99 names of Allah. As far as I understand, they all denote the same. Because anything else would carry composition into God, and this is surely undesirable. And this sounds pretty similar to the doctrine of simplicity according to the divine, to the Christian conception of the divinity. So, but there is some tension which I observe, and I hope I'm not completely wrong, and I don't fully understand it. On the one hand, Islam seems to endorse a highly abstract conception of God. I have a colleague in my department who is an expert of Islamic philosophy, who speaks Arabic, and he sometimes says that Islam is something like Neoplatonism for the common people. So it's highly abstract. It's very far away from normal notions of God. On the other hand, this very abstract God communicates very detailed and very unambiguous divine commandments, very detailed, very clear, and non-metaphoric and unambiguous commandments, down to, for instance, details of your nutrition, what you should rather eat or rather not eat, or what forms of clothing you should prefer. Or so I never quite understood how this high abstractness in the notion of God is compatible with the high detailedness of his governing our behavior. On the other hand, I have the impression that Christian notions of God locate both on a mid-level of abstraction and concreteness. So the Christian conception of God seems to me a bit more concrete, a bit closer to a normal understanding of personality, a bit richer in or a bit easier to grasp, and the commandments that follow or that are promulgated by God are also on a mid-level of complexity and detailedness. So there are no clear rules what you should eat, but there is a rule like not what you take into your body makes you unclean and dirty, but what is coming out of your heart and your soul, what you say, what you think, how you act. That's responsible for making you dirty or clean. So this is rather on a mid-level of complexity, and that matches the mid-level of concreteness and abstractness of the Christian notion of God. So perhaps we can find some clarification in this point here, but this may suffice for my brief introduction. Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed. I think that now David, can you just try to speak now?
Yes, you hear me now?
Yes, and very well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Löffler. I think now it's time to give the floor to Professor Legenhausen, and then we will have a time of discussion and debate. Please, Professor.
By the way, I have already one question, so just that you know that. Okay.
Please, Professor Legenhausen, the floor is yours.
Yes.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. I want to go over a few of the points that my good friend Vinnie Löffler has introduced, beginning with the difference between sense and reference, as the philosopher Gottlob Frege put it. I think this is a very important point that causes a lot of differences. It's very common for people to say, both among Muslims and among Christians, it's common to find people who say, oh, they don't believe in the same God as we do. They have a different God than we do. In Malaysia, for example, there was even a law passed that Christians should not use the word Allah for God, because they said, well, because the Christians, they're referring to something else. It's not our God. And Allah is the proper name of the God of Islam, not the Christian God. And also, I was once present at a meeting in Germany that was talking about these different ideas of God. And one of the people from the audience stood up and said, well, these Muslims, they don't believe in the same God that we do. Well, we believe in God as the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit. But the Muslims don't have that, so they have a different God. And so I think that there's a big tendency among people to think that because we have different concepts of God, that we don't have the same God. But if we utilize the resources in the philosophy of language, we can find good reason to establish that although there are differences in our conceptions of God, we refer to the same thing. So there's a commonality of reference, despite the fact of these differences in the concepts. Now, this is also subject to controversy, and we could go into philosophical detail about how much a concept has to be similar or different in order for us to have similarity or sameness of reference. And it's a really interesting topic of philosophy, but maybe some other time we'll get a chance to talk about that. But I thought that it's important to bring this point up in the beginning so that we can say that, well, if our aim tonight is to try to look at some of the differences that we have, well, the differences aren't in what we're referring to. The differences are in our conceptions. How do we think about God? Now, one of the differences that Professor Löffler mentioned is about this personhood of God, whether God is a person and what that can mean to be a person. Now, although it's true that, and I agree completely with what Professor Löffler said about this topic of claims about God's personhood, this is something that only occurred in the modern period. In the medieval period, the word person was used for the persons of the Trinity, but not for God himself separately. Although there are places where you can find the term person used for God as well, but very rarely. The definition that was given for a person early in the Middle Ages by Boethius was a substance with an intellect, a substance with an intellect. And so it was said that according to this definition, God is a person, because God is a substance and God is wise, so he must have an intellect. God is a substance with an intellect, so he's a person. But this was rejected in the Muslim philosophical tradition because the Muslim philosophers said, not only does God not have an intellect, but he's not even a substance. God is not a substance. Why? Well, because Avicenna said all of the Aristotelian categories, all of the different kinds of accidents and substance as well, these describe what's called in Arabic the mahiyya, the what it is, the what it is of which became the quiddity in the Aristotelian tradition. But God has no quiddity, according to Avicenna. God simply is existence itself, although that wouldn't become perfectly clear until many centuries later. But the seed of the idea of God being existence itself, I believe, can already be found in Avicenna. But this difference between personal an approach to God as a person and the approach to God that draws more heavily on the Neoplatonic tradition is one that divides tendencies that are common among Muslim theologians and Christian theologians today. Although this is not a static situation, people are, there's change going on right now. But most of the Muslim theologians do not agree with the claim that God is a person. I remember when I first became a Muslim, I started asking people about this question. And I started asking at the masjid, at the mosque. I said, what do you think? You think God is a person or not? And the Muslims looked at me like, what are you talking about? What do you mean is a person? You mean like another human being? No, he's not a person like that. What else could it mean? And this was interesting to me. At the same time, I was a member at that same period of time in a Christian theological group. They would meet every month to talk about different issues of theology. And I think all of the other members were Christian. And I asked them also, what do you think of this issue? Is God a person? And they looked at me like, of course, what else could he be? And it was like so clear for these people that yes, we have to consider God to be a person. How else can we relate to God? And that was interesting to me, that there was this difference in attitude. More recently today, I had a occasion to talk with some friends where I work and home about the issue of whether God is a person. And the first thing that they do is they say, well, how do we translate person into Persian or Arabic? He said person is shakhs, is the word that they use for person. But shakhs means an individual. So then the problem comes up with the problem of shakhsiyeh, that is individuality. Does God have individuality? But that's different from the problem that occurs in Western philosophical circles about whether God is a person or not. So this is a place where there's disagreement and misunderstanding oftentimes. And I think that's an interesting kind of misunderstanding. The roots, Professor Löffler also related one of the reasons that we find so much in common among Christian thinkers and Muslim thinkers is that our medieval theologians were all drawing on the Neoplatonic tradition. Avicenna, Farabi, they were heavily indebted to Plotinus and other Neoplatonic thinkers. But the way that they adapted the Neoplatonic philosophy to explain their own theology differed from the way that this was done among the Christians. According to the Neoplatonists, the highest thing is the one. And from the one, there proceeded nous, which means the intellect, nous. And from the one and nous, there proceeded psyche, or sometimes called pneuma, spirit. And the things that proceeded in the Neoplatonic tradition, these hypostases they were called, they proceed until you get to the into the world, into the material world, finally. When the Christians adapted Neoplatonism to their own theology, they said, oh, look, we have the Trinity here already. The one is the Father, and the Word, what we call the Word, the second person of the Trinity, this is nous. And the third person of the Trinity, the Spirit. The Neoplatonists also had that. These three first hypostases, these constitute the Trinity in Neoplatonism. The Spirit is in an interesting position because the Spirit is what forms almost as a bridge between the higher hypostases and the rest of the created world. Now, when the Muslims got hold of this system, they changed it. They said, we're going to accept the one as God alone. And what are we going to do with nous and pneuma? Those are creatures of God. Those are creatures of God. But they're eternal. It's okay. There are eternal creatures. Well, this opens up a big can of worms of how to understand the relation. But the way that Farabi and afterwards Avicenna went through this was they said, okay, we have at the top is God, the one. God does not have an intellect. God created the intellect. The first, and we have also narrations, religious narrations, that the first thing that God created was the intellect. That means the intellect is a creature. It's not something God has. It's a creature of God. And the Spirit also was seen as a creature of God. Well, what they did, actually, what the Muslims did was they said there's not just one intellect. We have a whole series of them, 10 intellects. And later thinkers played around with the number of intellects that you could have. But this was the way in which the Neoplatonic theory was adapted in the Islamic world. It is what happened. Well, it's important for the difference between Christian attitudes and Muslim attitudes was that in the Christian tradition, God has an intellect. God has an intellect. It's only the sublunary world, which is the created world, the world below the sphere of the moon, was seen as the created world. And what is above that, this is the heavenly world of God, the three persons of the Trinity, his angels. But for the Muslims, they said, no, creatures are not confined to the sublunary world. All these various stages of intellects, they're also creatures. So the mind, God doesn't have a mind. There was a conference in Iran some years ago talking about the relation of body and soul. And I delivered a paper there, does God have a mind? With the answer, no. And this was shocking to both many of my Muslim colleagues and the Christians. Well, I expected the Christians to be shocked by this because in the Western philosophy of religion, oftentimes theism is defined as the belief that there's a God who is a person and who has a mind. So if you deny that God has a mind, it seems to be almost a contradiction in terms. But as Professor Löffler pointed out, this is a modern phenomenon. So we had a modern philosopher of religion who visited us in Ulm some years ago, and he said, yes, these medieval philosophers, they were mostly not theists. Even Aquinas, according to this Daniel Howard Snyder, he said, I don't consider him to be a theist. Even Aquinas. He said, yes, Aquinas and Avicenna and these people, they didn't look at God as a person. They accepted a more Neoplatonic view of God. And this brings me to another important difference that we find. There's a tendency among many Christian theologians, by no means all, but among many Christian theologians today, to consider God as being eternal in the sense of always having existed in the past and that he always will exist in the future, but within time. While, according to the classical Islamic philosophy of religion, time is also a creature. God is not subject to the limitations of time. Time, following the Aristotelian tradition, is a measure of motion. And since God is completely incorporeal, motion doesn't have any meaning for God. God transcends motion. So God is atemporal. It's not just that God always was and always will be. It's that God is outside of time altogether. And this points to the radical transcendence of God. And I'm very glad that Professor Löffler raised this other issue of difference between Muslim attitudes and Christian attitudes towards our conception of God by pointing out the details of Islamic law. How can God be conceived at such an abstract level, to be even beyond mind, just pure existence? How can anybody accept that and yet think that this God is requiring me to do all kinds of things, to dress a certain way, to eat a certain way, to go through various kinds of rituals every day, to stand up 5 times a day and say prayers and things like this? How can that be connected? And the answer from the Islamic point of view is revelation. It's through revelation that we find these concrete injunctions. It's through revelation that we as believers are able to establish a kind of relation to God. If we were just left with the philosophers and the idea of God as existence, or the wajib al-wujud, that which is necessary in its existence, there really wouldn't be a whole lot to go on. But God reveals himself through the messengers he sent to humanity with guidance. And that guidance takes various forms and makes use of customs and social norms that are current in the society of the people. So it's not that God requires us to go to Hajj because there is something in the very nature of pure existence that requires this ritual pilgrimage, but rather we're required to go to Hajj because God in his mercy reveals to us a way to have a concrete embodied ritual through which we can form a relation with something that otherwise would remain very abstract to us. So I've tried to indicate some of the important differences that I see. Now, these are not absolute differences. There's differences in the way that the Neoplatonic tradition was appropriated by most Muslim theologians or philosophers, at least, and also what happened among the church fathers. There are differences in the tendencies among contemporary theologians about how to understand the personhood of God. And there are differences about between Christians and Muslims about how to understand what God's revelation is and what it means for how we're going to live. But again, I would agree with Professor Löffler that most of these differences can also be found within our denominations. So I think that there are, if we're looking for differences, there are greater differences between how certain Muslims think about God and how other Muslims think about God, and about how certain Christians think about God and certain other Christians think about God. There are greater differences within denominations, the major denominations, than there are across denominations. So I think that Professor Löffler and I probably have a more similar conception of God than we have to some of our co-religionists.